All right, guys, welcome to week 2. If you are listening to the dulcet tones of my voice, that means you stuck it out. You made it. You're still here. Awesome. Let's keep talking about graphic design. Okay. So last week we talked about what designers do, what the general design process is, and then we started to think about how we can do design brainstorming. Okay. This week we're going to really get into it. Okay, so we're going to talk about the first of 5-ish or so principles of composition. Okay, now, I'm just going to say this now. I say 5-ish principles of composition because just like graphic designers can't figure out how the hell to even define the phrase graphic design, no one can really fully agree on what the principles of composition are and how we should label them. Okay, so sometimes people call emphasis scale, okay, but I don't think that really gets to the heart of what we mean when we say emphasis, okay? Some people call movement flow. For example, some people call balance unity. Some people separate balance and unity into 2 separate compositions. Some people include hierarchy in this. Most people do. I include hierarchy as part of the principle of movement. But some people may disagree with me on that. There's no necessarily right or wrong answer to this. It's just how you're going to frame it, okay? And I have framed it in this way because I think it makes the most sense, it's the most logical, it's a good way to present it to students, and I have gotten feedback over the years to say that students tend to agree, okay? So if you see this as a different list of principles, some people will put white space in as a separate principle. Okay, if you ask me, white space is part of each and every one of these different principles here. So to me, it doesn't make sense to separate white space. But if you want to think about it that way, that's totally fine. I could not care less. Okay, as long as you have the understanding of the visual language, you're going to be good to go. Okay, so with that, let's talk about emphasis. All right. Now, you may think when you look at a poster, okay, let's say it's got an appealing graphic, it's a poster invitation to a party, maybe an album release party or something like that, and you may think that you're in control when you look at that, right? I choose to look at it, and then I choose to which parts of the poster to look at first. But that is not actually true. The designer is always in charge, okay? The composition tends to work when the designer successfully is able to force the viewer's eye to move in certain and specific ways. Okay, and that's what we're going to be talking about for the next 6 weeks or so. Okay, emphasis is when we make one specific element stand out. We draw the eye toward an element of our choosing. The designer chooses, not the viewer. By emphasizing certain elements over others, we will nudge the viewer to see the important elements first, right? So on that poster, is it more important to know what the band is? Or is it more important to know the website where you can go listen to their music, right? Well, no one's going to go to the website if we don't know what the band is, right? So I need to know the band's name before I go to their website, right? Now, this seems like a pretty obvious one. You wouldn't put the image of the artist really, really tiny in the corner, right? And then put the website or maybe the address or something like that gigantic across the page. It's just not logical, right? Okay, so how can we create emphasis? Well, we can do it with scale and weight. We can do it with grouping, placement and spacing, color. Color is so powerful. We can do it through a system of repetition disruption, and we can do it with what I like to call intrinsic interest. Some pieces are just so visually interesting that our eyes are going to go towards it. Okay, let's take a look at examples of every single one of these. Scale and weight. This is the easiest of all of them to really comprehend because scale is the size of an object relative to its surrounding. Because scale is the size of an object relative to its surroundings, and we all understand that some objects are smaller and larger than other objects, right? Then we also have weight, the perceived boldness or heaviness of an object, always in relation to its surroundings. Okay, scale and weight cannot exist in a vacuum, as they say. It's always in relation to its surroundings. Am I right? You did, in fact, read this before you read this. And why? Well, the scale of this was larger and the weight of it was larger. There's a little more to that, right? The placement was also higher. And typographically, at least in Western languages, we move from left to right and top to bottom. Okay? Clear, straightforward example of scale. There are only 2 elements on this page, and then a whole bunch of white space. The white space in this case is pink. Element 1, element 2. One of them is clearly scaled much, much larger. And that is because we want you to look at this image before you look at this image. Okay. Weight. Now, this is a business card, which I think is a very clever little concept here. It's for a sewing supply shop. And the business cards themselves have little bits of sewing supplies on them. Okay, so clever concept right off the bat. Let's take a look at this typographically, right? Especially in terms of weight. So first of all, we also have scale going on here, right? What's the most important thing to note? The name of the company, which is Dressel. Okay? Then on the bottom, we also have a weight. It is more important that I know that they sell sewing supplies than it is to know the address and the phone number. Why? Because no one cares about the address and the phone number unless they know what they're going to be buying, right? This is an example where weight also brings my eye towards something first. Okay, that's why we have bold text. Okay, it is an example of emphasis. Now, I like to throw in little design tips here and there. So here's the very first one. To see if a composition is working, you want to look at it up close and then take 10 steps back from afar. If we were sitting in a physical class, on many occasions, you'll be showing a piece and I will say, everyone come up really, really close. And then I'll say, everyone take 10 steps back. Does it still work? Okay, grouping. The principles of grouping are incredibly important. So much so that I've got a whole separate slide just to talk about grouping. Yep, that's how much I'm emphasizing how important grouping is. See what I did there? Grouping is the purposeful placement of elements in order to streamline information or to simplify lots of complicated information. Okay, we can group elements by placing them next to one another, by placing them with similar or like objects, by placing them within a boundary or some kind of enclosure, by physically connecting them in some way, by giving them a common fate, or any combination of the above. And of course, don't worry, I will give you examples of all of these. Okay, grouping by way of proximity. Now, we have 3 objects here. These are done by the legendary designer Paul Rand in the early 80s. IBM. It's an ad for IBM. Now, there is some similarity between this object and this one in that they both have striping. But there is not much similarity outside of just generic illustration style between this object and this object. And yet, I see this as one large grouping. Then I've got lots of white space, which in this case is black. And then my eye drifts slowly towards the bottom to that small type there. Okay. By grouping these in close proximity to one another, I make this look like one big sort of first read. This is the first thing that I look at. My eye goes straight to the center of the page to the I, B, and M graphics. Okay? I doubt any of you looked at this first. You probably all looked at this first. Emphasis by way of grouping through proximity. Okay. Grouping by proximity and similarity. Okay, so I see 3 major groupings on this page. 1, 2, 3. Now, by scale, by way of scale, this is where my eye looks first. Okay, but you'll notice that I have white lettering in a serif style typeface with high contrast. High contrast here meaning that there's a lot of thick letter form, parts of the letter form, and thin parts of the letter form. So we call that high contrast. And then I've got low contrast sans serifs, all mostly in black, not all in black. Okay, I have a combination of white and black, but because these letter forms are so close to one another that they're literally overlapping and sort of existing together and kind of interacting with one another, right? I see this as one large grouping. I see the forest for the trees, if you will, right? I see the entire group, the forest, before I see each individual letter form or numeral. Okay? So that's proximity, they're all close to one another, and similarity. They're not the same, but they're close enough that I see them as being part of the same group. Okay, now typically we talk about how we tend to look top down, right? So that goes back to this example right here. You'll read this before you read this. We tend to go top down, right? But in this example here, I go bottom up because one, these are in proximity. They're similar enough that the large letter forms look like an even large grouping. And then of course I also have scale involved too. Okay, grouping by way of placing elements within a boundary or enclosure. Now this can be a physical boundary or enclosure, or in this example right here, it's not a physical boundary, right? So I've got a whole lot of arrows. It's a very interesting design concept here, right? Because I don't actually have any images of a gun on this page, right? I just have a system of arrows. But by virtue of the fact that I've put these all in a sort of imaginary enclosure, I see this as a totally different concept. I see this as a gun instead of a bunch of arrows, right? So that boundary can be real, or it can be made through alignment or placement and spacing, or some sort of imaginary enclosure. So in this example, we have a couple different ways that we're creating grouping. Okay, so this is a relatively complex little infographic here. So let's kind of investigate a little bit. This is the 5-borough farm, seeding the future of urban agriculture. Okay, and what do I have here? I have a little grouping of various infographics. They're physically connected to one another. There are rules, little lines connecting them. Okay, and then I also have similarity of color. So these are all black, so I see them all as one. Let's take a look at these dots here. Now, I see this as one grouping, two groupings, 3, and 4. I see these grouped separately from one another. I don't see one big collection of dots. I see 4 collections of dots. Why is that? Because we have variation in their color. So color is so powerful that it trumps the similarity of the image. This purple dot here and this purple dot here, the exact same purple dot. They're even physically connected with a rule bringing them together. And yet, because of color, I see this as one group and this as a different group. Very interesting. Next, let's talk about grouping by way of common fate. Common fate is a phrase that came to us by way of the theory of Gestalt. Okay, if you've ever heard of Gestalt before, you've already got a little leg up on us. Okay, Gestalt principles were made popular by German psychologists at the Bauhaus in the 1920s. So these are early modernists. We'll talk a lot about these guys as we go through the quarter, okay? I'll even do a little separate lecture on the principles of Gestalt, okay? But this is one of those. So what do we have here? I have a whole bunch of red rectangles. This red rectangle, this red rectangle, this red rectangle, this red rectangle. They're all almost identical, if not exactly the same. Okay? And yet, my eye sees a grouping of 1 and a grouping of 2. Even though these are identical and in proximity to one another, they're right next to each other, right? But they appear to have different fates. The fate of these is to move up and down, up or down, I should say. And the fate of these is to move up this way or to eventually knock into these guys over here. So by virtue of the fact that they have different fates, I see them as 2 different groupings. You don't have to have groupings all moving in the same direction to have the same fate. Okay? In this example here, I have a really interesting typographic treatment, Darkness at Noon, a novel. And I see this sort of large grouping here first, radiating away from this intrinsically interesting little graphic in the corner, right? And I see this as one big grouping, even though this has a fate of moving out this way, this one moves out this way, moves out this way, moves out this way, right? But the fact that all of these are radiating out from the image groups them in my mind. I see this as one grouping, whereas this type, which is the same typography, right, the same letter forms, as a totally different grouping, okay? Because these have a fate of radiating out of this graphic here. And this has a fate of just sitting flat on one baseline at the bottom. Okay. Now let's talk about placement and spacing. Okay. Now, I've got a point in the middle of my page. Every time you put down a point in the middle of a page, you're sort of creating a grid of some kind. Now, this is unlikely to grab anyone's attention. But when you place something unusually or in an unexpected way, that's going to grab people's attention because you're dividing up the space in a totally different form. And people need to interrogate and figure out why. Now, intrinsically interesting image, right? Very powerful image. And the placement is sort of exactly how you expect it, right down the middle. Big and bold. Okay? So sometimes placing something just front and center is how you can grab attention. Sometimes placing something unusually will also grab attention. Okay? So this is for an article called Single Women. Okay? And we have this interesting placement of the phrase single women where you would expect to see a ring if a woman particularly, culturally it tends to be a woman, right? Wearing rings on their ring finger. Men do too, but we still more frequently see it on women's fingers, right? And so giving us a clearly feminine nail, right? This is clearly a woman's hand, and putting the phrase single women where you would normally see the placement of a ring emphasizes this little small typographic treatment, okay? I've got a lot larger type up here, but my eye goes straight here because of the unusual or sort of thematically relevant placement. Okay, this is an example that tends to either bore my students or wow them. Now, if you take a look at what I have here, not a lot on the whole page. This is a piece of stationery from the early 80s, and there's a little H, a little A, a little R, a little T, to the point where this is actually cut off in the corner, and the R is kind of pushed off the page a little bit by accident, right? And what do I have here besides these teeny tiny little letters? Just a single grouping at the top. And so by way of having all of this white space, so much space, my eye goes to the one spot where there's something to look at, okay? So white space can help emphasize what you have on the page. We also have spacing, okay? So in this example, kind of evokes a table scene, right? Got my phone face down, thematically relevant to the concept of privacy, right? And I have these images, or these little separate pieces here, separate little groups away from my primary image. Now I space this dead center. And in this case, I say, well, these are cropped off the page. They're spaced so far off that who cares? I can't even see what the rest of this is. These are so unimportant that they're spaced off the page. And so I see this grouping of phone and type first. Another little design tip for you, adding cropping or unusual placement can also create sort of boldness and intrigue, right? Because when you crop something in an unusual way, people wonder why. Now in this case, the unusual cropping brings me straight into that image, and it's unusual and strange and kind of cool, right? In this example, the cropping makes me pay even less attention. It sort of thematically helps build the concept, but these groupings are less important, right? So you can use cropping in many different ways. Another little design tip for you is the concept of a visual center. I will be encouraging you to use visual centering instead of actual centering throughout the quarter. So what we tend to do and you're going to go to a museum, probably no time soon, but at some point you're going to go to a museum, and you're going to take a look at the compositions on the wall, and you'll notice that everything is visually centered, which means you take your actual center line 50-50 and you boost it up by about 5%. Okay, you always have a little bit more white space on the bottom than you do at the top. This is also true for book layouts. So grab whatever book you're reading and take a look, and you'll notice that the margin on the bottom is a little bit larger than the margin on the top. Okay, it gives us a little bit of an emphasis boost, nothing huge, but a little bit of a boost. We can take whatever help we get, right? And it makes something less static, a little bit less boring, and a little less rigid. Okay, that's visual centering. All right, color. Now I'm trying to emphasize one element on the page. And we know that scale is a very powerful way to say, look at this first. But let's take an example. Let's look at the left-hand side first. Now, the computer is much, much, much larger than this little box here. And yet, my eye goes straight to the box because color is a really, really powerful way to emphasize something. Same on the right-hand side. I've got a photograph with actually an interesting sort of connecting element here. But because I've placed audiences are becoming fragmented in this bright, big, bold red, my eye jump there first, okay? And we will see this very, very frequently. Color is a very powerful way to grab emphasis to the point where it can be more powerful than scale. Okay, here's another really cool example. This is called the paper prison. And this was a series of posters that were created for the Nelson Mandela Children's Hospital Trust, and they're sized exactly at the size of Nelson Mandela's jail cell, okay? And the concept behind here is that you take this bright yellow poster, right, which is a very relatively small poster size, and you put it in large public spaces, right? So you go out into a city park or something like that. I think they were envisioning urban spaces, okay? Now, what emphasizes this little poster? Because the poster itself doesn't have a lot on it, right? It's relatively blank, okay? It has this quote here, but that's about it. So this image right here kind of gives us a clue. The color emphasizes the confining size of the jail cell when you compare it to walking out through the rest of the world. Now, 8 by 8, if you're standing in a 10 by 10 room, feels pretty large. But when you contrast that with the wider world and you emphasize that amount of space with color, you'll quickly see how small that jail cell actually was. Right? I think it's a pretty cool, powerful piece. Okay? Emphasis by way of color. The yellow is such a big, bold, bright color that our eye goes straight to it, especially against a field of gray. Next, we have a system of repetition disruption. Okay? Now, the others you probably are familiar with. We know what scale is. Right? We may not know the different ways you can group, but we know the idea behind grouping, right? Placing things next to each other so that they look larger, right? Okay, but let's talk about repetition disruption. I'll give you one example and you understand it right away, right? Because it's so powerful. I can repeat, and it just becomes sort of my background noise. But the second I disrupt it by changing even a small part of the typographic treatment, right? All I did was I made the type taller, a little bit bigger, but not that much bigger. I put it in caps instead of lowercase, and I bolded it a little bit. And now our eye goes straight to that bottom right-hand corner. Another great example. I have a field of lines, but all I have to do is take out a couple of lines for us to emphasize this line right here. And I bet you anything, all of our eyes went straight to this section right here. I'm sorry if we all got a headache. Now here's an example in a design context, now that we know what that means. Now, I have hands creating a frame. 1, 2, 3, but there's a disruption. Repetition, disruption. And so it emphasizes the word art. Finally, we have intrinsic interest. Some things are just so interesting to us as humans that our eyes are going to go straight there. Faces are one of them, especially eyes. Human beings biologically are conditioned to look for eyes and faces. Okay? Now, I instinctively go to this centerpiece right here. Why? Because the photograph itself, the image of the mother and child in this example, is just so intrinsically interesting. It's a very powerful image right away. Okay. By the way, this is a book cover for a Carrie Mae Weems photography book. She's a really great photographer, really worth taking a look at her images. Really cool stuff. Okay. So I see here a woman sitting at her kitchen table, right? Looking in a mirror and applying makeup. And then we see the daughter mirroring exactly what her mother has done, right? And just the idea of that, there's so much here to think about, right? The practice of grooming and preparation, right? The way we pass on those traditions to our children, the way women communicate with their daughters, mothers and daughters, right? There's just so much here to unpack right off the bat that I just can't look at anything else. I'm so fascinated by that image. Okay, that's intrinsic interest. Okay, a woman and a daughter, this part, much more interesting than this part, much more interesting even than the title. Okay, Prince is another great example. We actually have a pretty interesting typographic thing going on here. So Prince and then we have the R of revolution on one side and the rest of the letters on the other side. I think that's pretty interesting. And yet you can't compete with the way Prince looks, right? He's just an intrinsically interesting face and an intrinsically interesting posing, outfit, styling, everything. Now, in the discussion this week, we are going to talk about the various ways of creating emphasis in this particular poster. So this is another Paul Rand example. Paul Rand, very famous designer, actually did several poster covers for the UCLA Extension covers. And in the lecture, in the discussion this week, you are going to talk about which of the principles of emphasis are at work in this particular piece. So you're not going to say, emphasis is here. You're going to tell me which of the various principles of emphasis Paul Rand employs to specifically create emphasis. You're going to talk about if you think he did a good job. You can talk about if there's any room for improvement. You can talk about if there's a better or worse ways to create emphasis. Okay, but you'll write your ideas out. You'll post something. Once you post, you'll be able to see what other people have posted. Then you'll respond to each other and I will respond to you guys.